Hey, my name's Hubwood, and in today's video I'll test a big variety of games using the brand new MX550 by Nvidia, which unfortunately once more comes with only 2GB of GDDR6, and we'll find out later if and how much of an impact that is going to be. The laptop I'm going to use is the Dell Inspiron 2-in-1 7620, which also sports a brand new Alderlake Intel i7-1255U, 16GB of RAM, and a 16-inch 4K display, which for the sake of these tests I was running at Full HD of course. All games were recorded using a capture card, which results in some input lag, so please excuse my wonky and amateurish gameplay. I also have to point out that I would not recommend getting this laptop for gaming, as the WASD keys get insanely hot while gaming. In fact, so hot it's really uncomfortable and almost hurting the fingertips. To be honest, I haven't had such hot keys on a laptop ever before. By the way, as you will see later, the MX550 was using around 30 watts all the time. I'm assuming that it is the 25 watt version with dynamic boost activated throughout all games I've tested, as there isn't supposed to be a 30 watt version at all, but I'm not 100% sure of that, so as there are no official information by Dell available. And of course, the technical support didn't even know what I was asking them when I called the hotline. First up, I will test a variety of newer and older esports and multiplayer competitive titles, switching to some lighter or older games, and last but not least, we're gonna have a look at some more recent AAA titles. Oh, and the laptop was set to performance mode in the My Dell application. So without further ado, let's start with the first game. Today's first game will be CSGO, which I was running at high settings in 1080p, resulting in an average of around 104 FPS and only mild dips, resulting in a 1% low of 77 FPS. Now of course, most players want the FPS to be as high as possible, so you have quite some headroom here with lowering the graphics settings, since on lowest settings and 1080p, the average FPS is rising to around 165. In League of Legends, I was getting a very high average of 204 FPS and a 1% low of 130 FPS using the highest possible settings in 1080p. Of course, that game wouldn't cause any problem, but as a lot of viewers tend to ask about it, here you have it. So next up was Apex Legends, which on lowest settings and 1080p delivered a very smooth average of 117 FPS and a 1% low of 76 FPS. There would even be some headroom to rise some of the settings, as the small 2GB VRAM weren't fully utilized. Overall, I would say that was a solid experience, and you probably could even win around here and there with this laptop. Blizzard's Overwatch was running with an average of 83 FPS on high settings and 100% resolution scaling in 1080p with a 1% low of 40 FPS. You could further reduce the settings to get more than 100 FPS for sure. Lowering the resolution shouldn't be necessary though. Enjoyable and probably even suitable for more enthusiastic gamers. Next up was the quite successful free-to-play esports title Valorant, which I was testing on high settings in 1080p and saw an average of 211 FPS with a very high 1% low of 120 FPS. So that's definitely a good result and perfectly playable. I was actually a bit surprised that the game utilized the MX550 by 100%, which hasn't been the case with a lot of laptops I've tested. In Rocket League, the input lag caused me to absolutely fail. However, the MX550 didn't fail, and in a 3 vs 3 match it scored an average of 97 FPS with a 1% low of 39, while I was using the highest possible settings at 1080p. So it's safe to say that without input lag you should be able to enjoy the game in the best possible way. Call of Duty Warzone was actually playable in an okay way with an average of 55 FPS and a 1% low of 33 on the lowest settings at 720p. It's far from optimal and the aliasing is quite heavy with all this vegetation, but it's kinda fluid though. And I mean, it's for free, but the small VRAM definitely is a big problem in this case. In Fortnite, I was using the lowest settings with the highest view distance, which resulted in an average of 88 FPS and a 1% low of 36 FPS, which would probably be higher after 1 or 2 matches when all the textures and shaders have been loaded. The game became a lot more demanding over the last few years though, and I would recommend 16GB and at least 6 threads as well as an SSD to play the game in a fluid way. The last esports title for today was PUBG, which indeed has been optimized a lot over the years. Using the medium preset at 1080p resulted in an average of 63 FPS and a 1% low of 43 FPS on a smaller 64 player map. And that would actually be perfectly playable once more, especially considering this laptop only has a 60Hz display, of course. Well, the lighter game of today is probably Minecraft, which I've been running on the highest settings and 23 chunks of view distance without any mods, because I have absolutely no clue about Minecraft mods, sorry. And despite deactivating the 60 FPS lock, it still seemed to lock at 120 FPS somehow. I don't know about that, but I gave up and told myself that 120 FPS is just fine. The 1% low was 72 by the way, but I bet thanks to 16GB of RAM and the modern CPU, there is still some headroom left for a number of mods. Despite its age, Skyrim is still pretty popular and I was able to hit the 60 FPS cap basically all the time at 1080p with maximum settings activated. Once more, you probably could use mods to further improve the experience, as the MX550 usually didn't utilize more than 80% of its performance. The 1% low was weirdly consistent with 29 FPS though. However, the game is no problem for the MX550, or in that matter the Dell Inspiron. I've tested it on. Diablo 3 ran with 117 FPS on average and a 1% low of 56 FPS using the highest possible settings at 1080p while running through a Niflheim portal. I didn't expect anything else, to be honest, even though I have to admit I didn't expect the VRAM to be fully utilized in this case. It didn't seem to cause any problems though. Next. Life is Strange True Colors was actually running with around 53 FPS on average on high settings, resulting in a vast graphical fidelity. You actually don't need more than 30 FPS in games like this, as it's not that much gameplay related. But the high settings ensure that you can experience the game in a way it was meant to be enjoyed, perfectly playable despite the small 2GB of VRAM. Since GTA 5 has been released almost 10 years ago, I'd now consider it a lighter game as well, even though most would consider it a AAA game. On high settings with only a bit of anti-aliasing, I was getting an average of 72 FPS with a 1% low of 58 FPS, meaning you could perfectly cap the FPS at 60 and enjoy the game with good visuals. The experience is perfectly smooth and GTA Online would work just as well, I guess. And now we're going to take a look at the heavier and more modern AAA titles and see how the small VRAM is becoming an actual problem. Let's start with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, because this is actually the newest installment of the series that will work in an enjoyable way on the MX550. So I was actually using a mix of low and medium settings at 1080p, resulting in a very playable average of 51 FPS and a 1% low of 37 FPS. And as you can see, the graphics are actually alright and the FPS are perfectly constant, even in fights. And now watch what happens when we switch to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Because in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I had to pick 720p and lowest settings to get almost playable FPS. But I still only saw an average of 24 FPS and a 1% low of 18, which is below what I personally would call playable or enjoyable. The 2GB VRAM just seemed to become a real problem here, rendering the game basically unusable. On a brand new GPU, mind you. In 720p, that's kind of a hard pill to swallow and it's actually pretty sad to say the least. And things are actually getting quite ridiculous in the next game for today, which is Far Cry 6, and what you see here is actually gameplay for which I was using the integrated GPU of the laptop's processor, the Intel Iris Xe, because using the MX550 resulted in absolutely unplayable 4 FPS on average, even on 720p and the lowest settings. It just can't handle the game like that at all. However, running the game at 1080p and using the lowest preset with FSR on balanced on the integrated Iris Xe of the processor resulted in quite acceptable 36 FPS on average. I mean, that's not great for a first-person shooter, but it's way better than what the actual dedicated MX550 delivers. So I guess Intel's and AMD's APUs are about to render the MX550 kind of useless if they continue to improve with the same speed as before. But we also have to state that the game isn't optimized very well if it needs more than 2GB VRAM for 720p and low settings, as most games of today have better visuals than that using less memory. However, in Elden Ring I was able to achieve a playable average of around 48 FPS on low settings and 720p with a 1% low of around 30 FPS. It's far from great, but at least it's playable. There were only a few hiccups here and there, but the overall experience was mostly smooth and the stunning landscapes can still be enjoyed to a great extent in my opinion. I was testing Cyberpunk 2077 on low settings at 1080p with FSR in balanced mode to achieve an average of around 38 FPS and a 1% low of 21 FPS. The game looks quite blurry that way, but the FPS are playable. It's a pity the MX550 does not offer DLSS as people had hoped for. It is kinda playable though. If I had to choose between playing it that way or not playing it at all, I would definitely go for it. Of course, native 720p would be an option as well if you can't stand the FSR artifacts. And who knows, maybe one day FSR 2.0 will be saving our asses in this game. I was using FSR in balanced mode once more in Horizon Zero Dawn combined with low settings at 1080p and saw an average of around 34 FPS and a 1% low of 24 FPS. So capping the FPS to 30 would probably be the way to go in this case. The game doesn't look as blurry or faulty like Cyberpunk 2070 did in my opinion, and 30 FPS are definitely playable for a third-person action RPG. And last but not least, I was of course testing The Witcher 3 on the high preset with hairworks deactivated, resulting in a very playable average of 52 FPS and a 1% low of 34 FPS. What's kinda interesting to me is that despite the pleasing graphic, it only uses 1.3 to 1.5 GB of VRAM, and actually it looks better than Valhalla on low settings and 720p and running much smoother as well. So, and that was the last game for today. Feel free to browse around my GPU comparison videos in which I compare the MX550 directly to other similar entry-level laptop GPUs. As you can see, the GPU is fast enough for older and lighter games or most esports titles, at least on lower settings. AAA games from 2021 and 22 can't often run in an enjoyable way, and that will definitely get worse with upcoming games. It's safe to say that the MX550 is basically a slightly faster MX450 with the same small VRAM size, which has been too small for the MX450 already, considering that the 35W version of the RTX 3050 only uses 5W or 15% more energy, but offers over 50% more performance on average, and having DLSS makes it really hard to recommend the MX550 to anyone though. If you liked the content, please consider subscribing and feel free to like the video as well. By the way, if my time allows it, I'm planning to actually review the laptop used in this video very soon. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.